Hello and welcome to the Global Innovators in Business series. In this series, we interview leaders and innovators from different fields to share their experiences and advice with undergraduate students to provide inspiration and motivation. We're so happy to have with us Andreata Muforo. Andreata is a partner at Capital One, the original founding VC for Sub-Saharan Africa, focused on tech investments. TLCom announced the first close of its $150 million Thai African Fund, number 2, in January 2022. She's also currently on the board of Andreata and Twiga Foods. Thank you so much for being here, Andreata.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. So the first question is, what was your childhood like? What led you to be who you are?
This is a very broad question that you asked, an interesting question. I'm originally from Zimbabwe. I did my high school education in Zimbabwe, and then I won a scholarship to go to school in the US for my undergraduate studies. After that, I worked in New York City in finance. I've always been interested in finance and economics. And at some point, I wanted to come back. So after I finished my first degree, I wanted to come back to Africa because my passion areas are around working towards economic development in Africa. So the intersection of my areas of interest is private sector development, it's Africa, it's investing, and it's supporting entrepreneurs. So I'm trying now to chart my way back to the continent. And I decided to go to business school before I came back to the continent. So I went to Stanford University, the Graduate School of Business. So I got my MBA. And then after that, I started working my way back to the continent. I know you asked about my childhood, but this all kind of ties in terms of what is the thing that motivates me and excites me, which is about how do you create opportunities for people on the African continent so that they can live lives of dignity and they can get opportunities that other people have and that they may not have. And the way I see that happening is through the private sector and building businesses, so that you provide services and so that you employ people so that they can provide livelihoods for their families. Anyway, so after business school, I moved to Tunisia, where I was working with the Africa Development Bank. I was looking at the bank's investments into private equity funds. I also worked with the president of the bank at the time, Dr. Kaberuka. And then for personal reasons, I moved to about 12 years ago. And since then, I've continued to work in the private sector space. I say that I've sat at the same table, but on different chairs. So at the bank, I was looking at the bank's investments into funds, like our fund at TLCom. And then when I first moved to Kenya, I was working with an advisory firm, so working alongside entrepreneurs to advise them and support them to raise capital. And then I, met the founder of TLCom, Maurizio, about 10 years ago, and he shared with me what he was thinking about and asked if I wanted to join the firm, which was quite exciting around how do you leverage technology as an engine for growth and scale as you think about developing the African economies and supporting entrepreneurs. So then I joined TLCom, and I've been at TLCom since.
There's so much to dig in there, but what is TLCom? Could you give a short explanation of what types of investments that you look into? What is the goal of the fund?
So TLCom is a venture capital fund. So we invest in tech and tech-enabled businesses across Africa. So the firm itself used to be focused on Europe, but over the last 12 years, really started to look at Africa. And so we've launched 2 funds. So we have a Tide Africa Fund 1 and Tide Africa Fund 2. And we're investing in companies. Our sweet spot is the Series A and seed stage, though we have ability to follow on for companies that are performing. We look across the entire continent, but in the end, the vast majority of the deal flow are coming from the four primary markets, which is Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. And then you have secondary markets in terms of number of deal flow that comes out of those markets. So markets such as Ghana, Ivory Coast, Uganda, but our mandate is Pan-Africa. And you find that the companies that we invest in, they may start in one geography, pretty quickly expand into other markets.
So from your experience in TLCom, what has been the biggest shock, or what has been the biggest something that you didn't expect working with working with startups and working with different companies inside Africa?
Yes, I think for me, what has been the biggest shock in the initial stages of our fund was just how difficult it is to fundraise. We started back in 2013, 2014, when there was not a lot happening in Africa, in the Africa VC space, in the Africa venture capital space. There were entrepreneurs that were coming up, but just the knowledge of the space was not there. And it took us a couple of years to raise our first fund. Because so you find that there are investors who understand Africa, and those have mainly been investing, say, in traditional sectors, manufacturing, oil and gas, mining, and the like. And then there are investors who understand VC. So they're sitting out of Silicon Valley, they're in Tel Aviv, they're in other parts of the world. But to find the investor who sits at the intersection of Africa and VC was impossible, right? It's like a unicorn, extremely rare. So when it took us a couple of years to get to our first close because of that. So educating the African investors around what is tech and what is VC investing, and then the VC investors around where is Africa for some of them, right? And many of them don't invest outside of, say, San Francisco. So when you talk about Nairobi and Lagos, it's pretty far and very foreign to them. So I think just how difficult it is to fundraise for Africa was quite a challenge. And the ecosystem has since developed since then. There are more investors there. Even a lot of some investors in funds that are focused on investing in African funds. So it's gotten better, but it's still not a walk in the park, right? So let's say our first close, it took us 2.5 years to get to a first close for our first fund. For our second fund, it was almost like half the time. So it's getting better, but yeah, that's still a gap and the challenge in the market. I think in regards to entrepreneurs, I think what the learning that I've gathered or what I've seen is that these entrepreneurs are pretty similar. Like entrepreneurs in Africa are the same as entrepreneurs in the US, in Europe, in Asia. It's really individuals who are inspired to solve a particular challenge and are going for that. And I think what's interesting also is that because the African ecosystem is early, you quickly realize that they're operating in an ecosystem that it's a bit better now, but back when we started was non-existent. If you think about who are the advisors, who are the co-investors, they're not that many. When you look in other ecosystems, they're a door a couple of meters away from you. Somebody gives you some advice, whereas it's in the early days and even now to an extent, we're still building the ecosystem for African entrepreneurs.
So to convince other funds or to convince other investors to invest, you had to be very sure that you saw an opportunity in Africa in 10 years prior to this. So what did you see that made you make the switch into becoming a partner at TLCom?
Yeah, so for me, the main, there were a few things that I saw. So one was just the role of technology, right? I was sitting in Kenya where mobile money was ubiquitous at that time, right? So everybody was using mobile money. And this is a technology that didn't exist a few years before then. And now you can send money to your grandmother, to your grandfather many miles away, just using your phone. Like how powerful is that? So financial inclusion. And then, so that to me was the first sign of there's something here around how do you leverage technology to be able to provide the services that people really want, whether it's financial services, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's e-commerce. And when you look across the African continent, the penetration of basic services is very low. So I was intrigued by, what's the opportunity to layer technology to be able to provide those services? And also the fact that many people are low income, the vast majority of people are low income. So technology gives you an ability, one, to serve at a lower cost point. So you're able to also reach them in a cost-effective manner. You're able to collect data, which then you can use for insights and provide services that you couldn't before, right? Because African consumers are very much unknown because they were offline for a long time. But now with technology, with mobile phones, now you know them, you know their behaviors. So how can you layer services for them? So that's really intrigued me as one of kind of the motivators to join TLCom and go on this journey.
So while I was in Kenya, we talked to Mkopa, we talked to Cindy, we talked to Wasako. And I think many of those businesses relied very heavily on mobile money. I think that was like a pivot point for the entire, at least Kenya ecosystem. Do you think there are other pivots or other major shifts that are going on in the economy that could jumpstart or leapfrog other innovations in Africa?
Yeah, so I think there've been a few actually along the journey. So if you start from the first one was just laying fiber optic cable, right? That was big because you're connecting Africa to the world. Then the second one is the mobile phone. Now everybody can afford a mobile phone. And even more so now, phones are getting cheaper and cheaper, right? Then the next one is around how do you make data cheaper, more cost effective, so that because you find that many people use phones, but you find that actually the depth of the use of the phone is not that deep because data is expensive. So maybe they buy WhatsApp bundles, but they're probably not deeply surfing as you do as other people do in other markets. So I think the cost of data, like how do we come up with more technology that will reduce the cost of data? That's pretty pivotal and pretty transformational. And then of course there's mobile money and the fact that now you can, when you're building an ecosystem, you have to start with payments. Because you have to, well, no matter what service you're providing, people need to know how am I going to pay for the service. So the minute you unlock payments, then you are able to actually unlock the rest of the services, right? Because me as a business, I now know how I can get paid. And then I think, of course, what's happening right now with AI, that's also pretty big in terms of how do you use that to catapult some of a lot of businesses, a lot of processes and insights that we can draw based on AI. Then, of course, there's a conversation around crypto, which is actually the usage in Kenya and Nigeria is pretty high in terms of, especially in Nigeria, in terms of kind of as a store of value for people. This is, I guess, the stable coins. And more so, I think what's interesting is the technology, right? The blockchain technology and trying to see what are the use cases that can apply to the continent. I think that's another piece of innovation that's happening that can be quite transformational for Africa.
So interesting. I think we've talked to people in blockchain, we've talked to people in the mobile money sector. I think we've been in like the surrounding areas of AI, but like talking to you helps fill the context of how that will be effective in Africa. Actually, on that point, what types of companies do you think AI is like changing in Africa? How is that affecting the landscape and the startup ecosystem?
Sure. It's early days in terms of kind of the uses. So if I think within our portfolio companies and how they're using AI, so we have companies in the financial services space. So there's a lot of use there. We have a company in education. So they also are looking to see how can we use AI within our business model. So I think it's quite applicable. It's still early days in terms of kind of the depth of it, but it's around how do you, so if you think about the education company, for example, that's working with a student. So you're trying to get a student to get content that's at their level and making sure that as they progress in whatever subject that they are learning, you're continually challenging them. So there's a place where you can use AI as well.
Yes, I think I was listening to a podcast by Sal Khan from Khan Academy, and the ability to take all of the content that he created and the Khan Academy created and tailor it to different audience members and different people. You can take this like education, which used to be like very narrow in one group, and spread it out to the entire world. So that's insane. And actually, on the topic of education, I know TLCom actually hires a lot of different people from around the world, like Stanford Graduate School of Business, like very top schools around the world. And also they hire people from in the individual local Kenyans or in the local markets. How have you seen the difference between the two perspectives of the different types of like hires in your company? And why do you have such a focus on attracting the different diverse perspectives?
Yeah, so we look for when we're hiring, right? It's important to have the local context because we're investing in companies in different geographies, right? So I think so we believe that it's important that you hire people, local people who also understand that local company context as Telcom as well as our portfolio companies, because I think you lose something if you're just a company of expats, right? Because you're serving, if your market is a local market, you best have to have some local people in there to understand the culture. They have the networks, right? They've been operating in those ecosystems for long. So that opens up that network for you. Then there's the other piece around global exposure, because with globalization, we don't live in a vacuum of our own country, right? Everything is interconnected. You need networks. Like I was telling you earlier around when we were fundraising, we traveled from Europe to North America looking for capital. So you need people who also have that network and that can leverage that network to explain and show people the opportunity in Africa. So you need both perspectives when you're building a global firm like we're building here at TLCom. And of course, there's the value in diversity in general because you have broad perspectives, you have deeper networks. So like our team is actually very diverse. So not only in terms of kind of our ethnicities or gender, but also in terms of our experiences, right? In terms of our partners, we have an Israeli partner who was an entrepreneur. You have myself. I worked in financing in Africa and in M&A advisory. We have Omobola Johnson, who was the managing partner at Accenture and then was the ICT minister for Nigeria for 5 years. And then we have Aloho, who was with the Endeavor Network, and Mauricio, who was with Bain and with McKinsey, and he lived in Europe for many years. So you can just imagine like how the depth of our conversations and our experiences, and then we bring all that to the service of the entrepreneur. We're within 1 to 2 degrees of what an entrepreneur needs, just because of the diversity of our team.
Understood. I think, yeah, that's really interesting perspective. As I was traveling in Kenya, like the biggest question I had was like the education aspect. Like it's still difficult. And as you were saying, like these like AI technologies can help broaden and localize this like education to the individual context. But until now, I think it's still very difficult for them to receive or to have the same educational effort so that they can continue to push their different businesses in like this in like having education is so helpful as a tool to like help you broaden or go up in society. And how did you manage those challenges in your childhood? And how did you find yourself getting a scholarship to Grinnell and finding that path?
I can tell you that I have a formula. A lot of it is, I say, the grace of God, because I didn't even know Grinnell existed. So I think it was probably a mixed work, meeting opportunities. So I was one of the best students in my high school. So when an opportunity came to join a program that was helping students apply to schools in the US, my principal gave me the letter to apply into that program. It's called the USUP program. And it was through that I then applied to schools in the US, and I managed to go to the US. But you're right in the sense that, yes, the opportunities are not available to everybody. And they still, yeah, the exposure is very different depending on which school you go to. I think and also interestingly, because of technology, that gap is getting even wider, right? So can you imagine now with ChatGPT and AI and all of this stuff, there are people who are not on the internet as we speak, so they actually are not recognized even in that world because they're not online in the same way. So we need to find ways to fill that gap between that technology is also creating in a way. I think technology also helps to an extent, depending on kind of the resources that are available to you. Because if you think about it, Coursera, for example, there are all these other platforms where now you don't necessarily need to go to a university, a physical university, to get content that you need, right? Like ChatGPT, like I was exactly as well. They say you can get access to it. You now also have access to lots of information. You can also have access to online education as well. So I think it's you need to kind of balance. So there are benefits that technology is bringing, but also recognize that there are some people who are being left behind, even in this pursuit. And then it's really up to the governments to be able to make sure that the resources are available to the students so that they become competitive in the global world.
That's really good context. The other question I had was, until now, TLComp has mostly been focused, or generally been focused on Nigeria, Kenya, and a few countries, and like going into Egypt. So how are you thinking? So what is like the missing link, the missing challenge for some of the other countries like Botswana or other places to have companies that are worth investing this much in? What is like that hurdle that they need to cross to get to a point where VCs like TLCom will see the potential in them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the way I look at it is they're always centers of entrepreneurship or centers where capital gravitates towards where the entrepreneurs are. And there's a number of things that are at play there. And I think also, for example, one is the markets. If the country is small, so for me as an investor, when I'm investing, I'm asking myself, is this a large market? Africa has 54 countries. And so then a few of them are fairly substantial. It's the same effort to build a business in Botswana is the same effort as to build a business in Nigeria, right? Nigeria has over 200 million people, and Botswana is much smaller than that. So you can imagine that the pull is to the larger markets because you're going to need to go through the regulatory requirements. You're going to need to hire capital or attract capital into your market. All of those things you're going to need to do. But if the market is larger, then you're able to really scale the business. So I think the market size is one piece for sure, which is why you see the four: Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa being at the core. But again, these entrepreneurs are also expanding outside of their main markets and then moving across East Africa, for example. So many businesses, they start in Kenya, then they also move to Uganda and to other neighboring markets. So I think that's one thing. The market is pretty key. And then also the enabling environment. Is this a country that's welcoming to entrepreneurs, that has the infrastructure that's needed? to build the business, whatever business that the entrepreneurs are pursuing? What is the level of entrepreneurship in terms of even just culture? Also, that plays a part. Because also, if you think about it, think about the US, you also have centers, right, which people are really trying to broaden even more. But for a long time, it was Silicon Valley and Boston, but now it's moving into other places as well. And the US is a little bit easier because at least it's one large market. So in Africa, you can imagine the complexity there. But I think also what ends up happening though is that you have regional markets. You can start in Egypt and then you think about Morocco, you think about the other rest of North Africa. You start in Kenya, you think about the rest of East Africa like that.
So interesting. I think it's really difficult to grasp how different or how difficult it is to go from one market to another in Africa. It seems all in the same region, but like each place has their own policies, own governments, own regulations, and it's really difficult to cross borders and create a business that kind of like is a pan-Africa business because there's really, really few and far between businesses that are truly pan-Africa, as all of them are so different. The other question I think that falls into this VC investment category is there's been a lot of investments in developing markets, at least in the past 5 years. There's been more of a focus in developing markets, diversifying their portfolio. And because of this, we see some more money coming in, but there's still relatively few larger companies that have a ability to like fundraise for a B round, fundraise for a C round. Like there's like larger companies that have like more ability to receive funds. And so potentially what happens is all of this money like conglomerates or gets filled into these like larger companies that are trying to raise funding. And this potentially could lead to overvaluation of the individual companies and make it more difficult to raise a profit for a VC. So how are you thinking about addressing this issue? And how is like the entire VC community managing the expectations on what types of investments they should fund and like when to stop?
It's a good question. So I think what I would say around the later stage companies is one, it's a pretty early ecosystem, the Africa tech ecosystem in general. And so there are now more seed companies and Series A companies who over time are growing and then they'll be at the later stages. So I think that's an important point to make because also even with the capital that's coming, it's still not a lot, right? So if you can imagine, I think in 2016, 2015, the entire African continent raised about $215 million, $215 million, right? Then you fast forward to last year, it's closer to $5 billion that was raised. But that's still very small if you compare this to other markets. Compare it to India, compare it to Silicon Valley. It's like 1 to 2%. It's still pretty low when you think about the capital that's being attracted. So yes, we've moved from where we were to where we are now, but it's still not a lot of capital that's available. So we still need to do quite a bit of work to attract capital. And what you also find is that the later stage companies are mostly need to go and fundraise outside of Africa because there are not many large African VC funds. So they're probably between us and a few other players, there may be like 5 or 6, right? Which is just not enough capital in order to really grow and expand and scale the business. So there's need to go to look for capital outside, which also makes it quite challenging. Because again, you need to educate around Africa, you need to educate around your business model and then the nuances of your particular market. So I think, yes, there's more capital coming, but it's actually not that much. And on the point around what's happening around valuation, making sure that companies are not overvalued. Of course, it's great to have soberness within the ecosystem as a whole. Because then you build a more sustainable ecosystem, right? What had happened, and it's not just in Africa, I think globally, maybe even more so in the West, is that in 2021, just due to quantitative easing and monetary policy, you saw a lot of capital flowing. And that actually resulted in a market where there was quite a bit of overvaluation. And a bit happened in Africa as well, but I don't think it's necessarily to the same magnitude as probably in other places. And I think there's a correction now that's happening, which is good. And I think it's great that now the entrepreneurs who are still in market are entrepreneurs with strong businesses, strong fundamentals, and unit economics that you can then scale. And then also you're really building the strong entrepreneurs within the ecosystem. So it's not just about raising capital from investors as the way you source capital, but it's because your business is actually making money also. So I think now the market has gotten, I think it's now at a more sustainable level. Of course, there's been quite a bit of pullback from global capital just because they're going back to their home markets just because of what's happening with the rising interest rates. So it's a little bit tougher to actually raise in this market. But companies that are performing well are still raising, because you keep in mind that funds were raised, right? So funds still need to deploy. It's just that capital is now more selective. So there's still some capital, but it's now more selective.
That's a really good answer. And yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. We really want more money to be funding Africa and helping more businesses grow. But at the same time, we want there to be a very good incentive for those for VCs or investors to also see an opportunity and continue to invest as well. So in 10 years, in 20 years, and in 30 years, what do you think Africa will look like with new technology, new businesses? What is the growth trajectory?
So my dream, because of course there are always limitations and challenges, but what I would like to see is in many African countries, like move from low income to middle income, more people being moved out of poverty or just, existence and subsistence to actually growing in their wealth and having more options. And wealth is not just for money for itself, but it gives you options. It gives you an ability to try new things. So I think I would like to see like African economies like grow in terms of income for the people. In regards to technology, and technology can't solve everything, but I think it plays a critical part. And the more we can integrate technology into how we do business, into how we serve clients, students, I think we'll advance quite, that'll be quite useful. For example, in education, there's just not enough teachers to teach the number of Africans we have and that are being born as we speak. So the question for me is, how can we use technology to give us that scale that we need? Because it's not going to be teacher standing on the board and teaching. It's going to be technology that has to play a part in that. So if we can have technology that's actually serving the very need that we want, that's significant success for me.
Thank you so much. One question that we always ask all of our guests is, if you had any advice for students around 20 to 30 years old seeking to grow impact, develop impact in their career, what would you do? So what would be your answer to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess first, probably is to find out what is the impact for you, because impact means many things for many people. So what I would say is first, figure out what does impact mean for you. That could be, some people want to be teachers, some people want to start a business, some people want to work in government, some people want to work with an NGO. So I think, and also the thing is also, it's not about figuring everything out today or even tomorrow for that matter, but I think it's to follow your the things that, I don't want to use the word passion because sometimes I feel like it's overused, is to follow your interests. What are the things that are interesting you right now? What are the things that you're caring about right now? And then you pursue that. Because I think in this day and age, also, people don't usually stay at one career for the next 50 years, right? You're continually evolving and you're continually discovering new things. So it's about what are you interested in now? What is it that matters to you now? Then you pursue that. And then through that, you learn and you probably evolve. You're thinking about how to solve a particular challenge. I remember when I actually went to business school, one of the things that what I wanted to do right after was work in microfinance. And so I did an internship in microfinance. And while it's fine, for me, I walked away thinking, gosh, I want something bigger. Like it's helpful for the entrepreneurs that it's helping. But I wanted to now work with larger businesses, deploy more capital to these companies so that they can grow and scale. But it's because I went into microfinance and I spent a summer there and got a sense of what it is that they do. And then I stopped again and I paused, okay, how does this fit with me? So then that pushed me now to the next career decision that I made. So I think part of it is, yeah, also just go out there, actually do work, find something to do and do the work, because many times we romanticize what it's like to work in a certain space or in a certain area, because also usually they're buzzwords, right? There's something new and hip that's happening, and you're like, oh wow. But the only way you will know if that's a fit for you is by going to work there. So find opportunities to volunteer and to get that opportunity, then you can decide and see if indeed that's what you'd like to do. And be open to changing and to evolving. And you can always also go back to school if you decide that I actually want to restart this whole thing again. Because I think also sometimes I think the younger generation now, sometimes we're under a lot of pressure to figure it out now and to do it now. No, actually, life is a bit of a marathon. Huh? So just take gap, do you, it's okay to try something, see how that goes, and look for other opportunities if that doesn't work out for you. With social media, there's so much pressure for young people. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, finding your passion and actually trying it out and experiencing it is really so helpful. I think I had that in my own career in doing things that I really liked, and then realizing that is actually something I really liked. Even this interview series is a part of that picture.
Great. Thank you for doing this, because I'm an ambassador for Africa, and it's great the more people who get to hear more about what's happening on the continent, because I think there's quite a bit of ignorance around what's happening in Africa, because the media never covers it right. So I think it's really great for you and your team to be coming to the continent, speaking to entrepreneurs, speaking to investors, to find out what's really happening, because I think those are the change makers that are going to bring development onto the continent. I always talk about one of the things that excites me about what I do is the ability to work with, most of the entrepreneurs are young people. So anywhere below the, I guess for me, anyone below the age of 40s. Yeah. So people in their mid-20s, 30s, 40s that are actually solving problems and challenges that have been there since my grandmother, since my mother, and now they're thinking about, how do I tackle this? They may not all succeed, but my goodness, they're giving it a really good go. So just the opportunity to fund those ideas and help the entrepreneurs bring them to life, and build a better economy and social environment on the continent is very exciting for me.